Story 1. I'm a woman, and back in the 90s, my family got a home computer. It was a big deal for us, as we didn't have much money. We used it for schoolwork and playing classic DOS games. My dad figured out how to install a screensaver with sound effects. I was quite proud of himself. However, he forgot to tell my very religious mother about it. So one day I was called to the principal's office in the middle of the second period. I was a straight A student and had never been in trouble before, so I was confused. When I arrived at the office, I was told that my mother had called, very distressed, and that I needed to go home. The secretary told another staff member that my mother was losing her mind. I rushed home to find her pastor performing an exorcism on her computer, while my mother prayed fervently through sobs. My dad arrived home shortly after and started laughing hysterically when he saw what was happening. He called my mother a few names and then went to the computer and wiggled the mouse to bring it up. The Darth Vader screensaver started playing, with all the iconic quotes. "Give in to your anger. With each passing moment, you make yourself more my servant. I find your lack of faith disturbing. You underestimate the power of the dark side. If you will not fight, then you will meet your destiny." Of course, my mother couldn't get the computer to do it again because she kept messing with it, so it never went back to sleep mode. She was convinced that our computer was possessed by the devil. The pastor quietly snuck out during my dad's laughter and my mother's sobs. Yes, for those who were asking, my parents are still together. My mother can be difficult to deal with at times. My dad has learned to just agree with her and try to defuse situations. The pastor was called in by my mother, just like when I was from school. I honestly don't know if he believed my mother. He never saw or heard Darth Vader, but they kept touching the mouse and moving it, which prevented the computer from going to sleep. But I do know that my mother fully believed it, so the pastor did what he could do to help her. I also don't know if my mother actually saw and heard the screensaver or if she just heard it. I've always assumed that she was busy elsewhere and only heard it. That was bananas. Good thing her mom didn't wreck the PC like it was the Death Star when Vader started talking. Story 2. My father was a Baptist pastor, but he had no problem with me playing Dungeons & Dragons, at the 3.5 edition at the time. However, when he married my stepmother, who was a religious zealot, he was obliged to stop me. One day I came home from school to find my parents sitting in the living room with all of my D&D books in a plastic bag. My stepmother had convinced my father that they should throw them away. I challenged them, asking how they could know the books were bad if they hadn't even read them. My stepmother picked up the player's handbook and started reading the description of the cleric spell chant. If two clerics of the same religion are chanting, the bonuses are… whatever. She didn't know the word cumulative. I turned to my father and said, "How can you say these are bad if you don't even know what the words mean?" He agreed and gave me my books back. So yeah, my stepmother's limited vocabulary saved my D&D books. Strangely enough, she didn't ban me from reading The Lord of the Rings. In fact, both of my parents encouraged me to read Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, both of whom were nice, safe Christian authors. As someone who grew up in the Chronicles of Narnia, I can tell you that it's basically about a group of siblings who played Jesus D&D. But hey, Gary Gygax was a Christian, so checkmate to all the satanic panic losers. I also want to share with you that when I was in junior high school, the mom of a friend of mine made him stop playing D&D with us because she thought it was demonic. This is even though he went to our church and the dungeon master, which was me, was the pastor's son. Come on. Story 3. Traveling back to the 80s, I have this memory of my overly zealous aunt who exclaimed, "It's satanic! There's only one master of the universe, and it's God," when she caught wind of me watching Masters of the Universe. As a child, my eye roll game was so strong that you could practically hear it. Then there was Bill Nye the Science Guy, and every time during the intro Bill chanted, "Science rules," my aunt made sure to counter with a firm, "God rules." The level of insecurity in people who pull this kind of stuff off is truly something else. My niece told me about her experience with Harry Potter. Back in her church days, she discovered the enchanting world of Hogwarts and fell head over heels for it. So she decided to share her newfound joy with the pastor she knew, and as expected, he launched into a whole, "Oh no, that teaches witchcraft" speech. My niece wished she could have told him, "Okay, read Harry Potter, cover to cover. Take diligent notes, practice those incantations, and for extra credit, get yourself a cauldron. Then seek out a bona fide witch's coven and see how many of those Hogwarts credits actually transfer." She told me her very first introduction to Harry Potter was around the release of Goblet of Fire in 2000, and it seemed like that was the only thing CNN wanted to talk about at the time. They even hosted a town hall meeting where folks debated whether the book was satanic. One woman confidently claimed it was absolutely evil and then dropped the bomb that Chronicles of Narnia was also satanic. You know, the series that's basically a Bible allegory and penned by a prominent Christian theologian. Yeah, that one. Story 4. Movie theaters were taboo for my dad during his childhood. It's because his parents were super religious. And speaking of similar parental bans, my friend's parents wouldn't let her watch any Jim Carrey movies thanks to that wild devil horn hairdo in Ace Ventura. And then there was Pokemon. My aunt once tried to convince me that Pokemon cards were so evil they could burn holes in the Bible. Turns out that logic was way too easy to debunk. Another time, a childhood friend's mom banned my Game Boy from her house because I played Pokemon on it. She thought it was demonic. My parents respected her house rules but drew the line when she suggested taking away my Pokemon games entirely. As if that wasn't enough, when my mom remarried, my stepfather threw away my brother's precious first edition holographic Charizard card, along with many others from our collection. He said they were satanic. He was clearly misguided and remains a jerk to this day. And I had another friend whose mother went so far as to burn his Pokemon cards for the same reason. When he switched to Magic the Gathering, he stashed the cards at my place to avoid another round of burning. We were informed that his mom was going through a tough bout of mental illness at the time. Thankfully, she's gotten the help she needed and seems to be doing better now. Sheesh, can't believe the hate on Pokemon. The only bad thing Charizard has ever done is use Blast Burn on my wallet. It's super effective. Story 5. Hard Rock. My silly aunt thought that AC/DC stood for Antichrist Devil Child. She's a real blockhead. She's also the most obvious in denial person I've ever met. I'm not the most perceptive person, but I know she's as gay as the day's long. Maybe she'd be happier if she got out of the closet instead. And then there are the literal rocks. I'm a rock hound, meaning I collect rocks, gems, and stones. People have called me a devil worshiper for my interest in crystals and spirituality, which is ridiculous. I don't even use them spiritually. I just like shiny things. I also want to tell you how my friend's mom cut the tail of his Nightcrawler action figure because it looked like the devil's tail. She also didn't appreciate the medieval Spawn figure I gave him for his 9th birthday. Story 6. I remember a woman who claimed she wouldn't eat mushrooms because she thought they were sinister, being that they grew in the dark. And speaking of misconceptions, my high school biology teacher saw me wearing a peace symbol and took it upon himself to explain its supposed satanic origins. According to him, it was an inverted cross with the sides bent down and away from God. Of course, this was pretty ridiculous. In reality, the peace symbol was adopted from the British nuclear disarmament movement in the 1950s. It's actually a combination of the flag signals for the letters N and D. My classmates also told me that the peace symbol isn't satanic at all. In fact, it's the symbol of St. Peter. For centuries, the Catholic Church used only upside-down crosses because they believed that the right-side-up cross, the very instrument used to crucify Jesus, was disrespectful. You know, that does make some sense. I mean, if I were finished off with a sword, I wouldn't want my followers sporting sword medallions around their necks. Early Christianity is brimming with fascinating symbolism that would likely surprise many modern Christians. Even the pentagram, often associated with the devil, was originally used to represent the 5 nails from Christ's cross. In fact, you can still spot it in some old church windows in Europe. It's curious how it became synonymous with Satan, given that its original purpose was to protect against demonic forces. Story 7. My mom decided to cut up our original Disney cassette collection, and she even destroyed a PlayStation just because she thought there was a devil's number engraved in the chip, which, by the way, wasn't true. They attempted to run over my Game Boy with a truck, but it miraculously survived. However, a woman from the church cruelly destroyed my Game Boy. Ironically, her kids got their own Game Boys the very next week. As if that wasn't enough, the church my parents dragged us to had a knack for labeling everyday things as satanic. Disney, dragons, non-Christian music, Pokemon, Yu-Gi-Oh!, and all gaming consoles were all on the hit list. Basically anything that brought joy to a kid was out. Even the same teacher who taught the abstinence-only the birds and the bees class thought it was right to snatch away my deck of magic cards, claiming they were satanic. Like, how was I supposed to keep myself pure without my magic cards? Word. Magic cards are the ultimate distraction. Who needs to swipe on Tinder when you can just swap cards and duel? Story 8. My grandma had a thing for hats, mainly because she wanted to keep her head warm and cozy. She had this one beloved bunny ear hat that she proudly wore to church. That was until one fateful day when the pastor declared her hat as an embodiment of evil, snatched it right off her head and chucked it into the trash. Needless to say, my grandma was really furious. She returned home hatless, but the church folks weren't done with her. They showed up for an exorcism, convinced she was a vessel for the devil himself. I can still recall being a bewildered kid, retreating upstairs as the church choir belted out hymns while the pastor did his thing with his hand on my grandma's head. It left me feeling a mix of anger and confusion. My mom advised me to stay downstairs. Now I can't help but wish those people would dare to pull the same stunt today, because if they do, I'd personally kick them out of the house. Story 9. They condemned a painful toothache, and the quote I heard was, "The devil's trying to get in my body." At first, I thought they were cracking a strange joke, but it turned out they were deadly serious. I also have an experience from kindergarten when my teacher had a coughing fit during Bible stories. Yes, it was a religious private school. She apologized, took a sip of water, and proclaimed that the devil was attempting to obstruct her from reading to us. As a child, that was downright petrifying. I genuinely believed the devil was present in that room, lurking invisibly. Looking back now, I realize she was just a kindergarten teacher in a classroom full of little germ factories. But in those early years, there was no doubt in my mind that the devil was among us. Story 10. I once knew a woman who refused to eat deviled eggs. Also, my wife told me that her cousins weren't allowed to eat candy on Halloween when they were kids because their mom didn't want to celebrate the devil's birthday. And once, I heard a zealot describe Flamin' Hot Cheetos as a product of the devil, without a shred of sarcasm. If Satan takes souls for eating Cheetos, I'm pretty sure he won't take mine. Well, I'm already happy with Cinnamon Toast Crunch. So, did these stories give you the Divine Comedy vibes? If they did, then click that like button and subscribe to my channel. Story 11. Godzilla. Once upon a time, I knew a man who strongly refused to say the name of the famous movie monster, Godzilla. In his eyes, it was really wrong to invoke God's name in that manner. He told his kids that there had been a spelling error and that the monster's true name was in fact Godzilla. He was ignorant that Godzilla was literally the English rendition of the Japanese word Gojira, which translates to whale lizard. Flashback to the past decades, and you'd find a lot of things that some fundamentalists deemed questionable, including barcodes, yoga, meditation, and various music genres. I even attended a Christian private school in a small town, and one teacher in particular was angry about his students' penchant for artists like Michael Jackson, AC/DC, and other big names of the era. But perhaps the funniest condemnation was against dancing. During my time at a conservative Christian college in the 1980s, there was a running joke that getting a little frisky was bad because it might lead to dancing. Yes, for some bizarre reason, the administration considered dancing as totally evil. Cue the Footloose soundtrack. Story 12. Being left-handed. I once attended a church where they wouldn't allow me to play music simply because I was left-handed. It's baffling how historical witch hunters had their own misconceptions, believing that left-handed people were somehow witches due to this unnatural trait. And it's worth noting that the term sinister finds its roots in the Latin word for left. But the left-handed struggles didn't stop there. My dad had his own weird beliefs. He banned me from watching anything involving magic or monsters, fearing it would invite demons into our home. This censorship included shows like Power Rangers, Ben 10, H2O Just Add Water, Harry Potter, Scooby-Doo, and more. Perhaps the most ridiculous of all was his decision to ban me from watching Jessie on the Disney Channel. Oddly, the show had no trace of magic or monsters, but he was convinced that the pet lizard owned by one of the characters symbolized the serpent that tempted Eve into taking a bite of the infamous apple. Story 13. In my younger days, my mom had some concerns about my art. I used to draw dragons and horned wolves, which she deemed as satanic. She also called me out for drinking Monster. But looking back, I'm pretty sure it was all because of the marketing ploy. When Monster gained popularity during my youth, there were widespread rumors that it was somehow connected to the dark side. This stemmed from the claw marks in the logo bearing a resemblance to the Jewish number 6. But hey, this was the early 2000s, the era of emo and scene culture where teenage rebellion was practically a way of life. So of course, we young rebels actively sought our Monster energy drink just because it had a reputation for being a bit demonic. Nah, anyone who always drinks Monster is more likely to become diabetic than satanic. Story 14. Being vegetarian. It's like giving the devil's lettuce a whole new meaning. I got the impression that there are a lot of people who just label any change in the culture they are used to as satanic because they have no logical reason to oppose it other than I don't like change. Also the sound of an electric guitar. Pure mental gymnastics. I heard a nutter going on about how the devil uses the drum beats and rock music to convince souls to do things that made them impure. And you could tell because they sounded like the same drum beats that you hear in the savage tribes of Africa. Yeah, good old American fundamentalists. They always managed to add some racism into the mix. Story 15. Frank Zappa's album Jazz from Hell was required to have a parental advisory explicit content sticker, even though it is instrumental. This was because Tipper Gore and other members of the Parents Music Resource Center, PMRC, were trying to censor music and force record companies to label albums with lyrics that they tagged as offensive. The PMRC's campaign eventually led to a congressional hearing where several prominent musicians were asked to testify. Zappa, who had a reputation for being a wild and rebellious musician, was actually an incredibly intelligent and articulate thinker about music and culture. The PMRC hoped that he would embarrass himself at the hearing. He instead gave a cogent argument against the moralizing. This was a clear act of censorship, and it showed the absurdity of the PMRC's campaign. Story 16. My friend recently went on a rant about yoga. She warned me that stretching your muscles make you vulnerable to demonic possession. I was really shocked. It reminded me of when I was a teenager and I was told something similar about spacing out. You know, those moments when you stare at a beautiful view or a blank wall, letting your mind drift for a while? Well, I wasn't allowed to do that. I'd get into serious trouble every time my mother walked into my room and found me not actively engaged in something. It's as if keeping your mind active was the ultimate demon repellent, while clearing your mind in yoga and similar practices were inviting them in. Seriously, the only wicked thing about yoga is probably those pants. One stare and even the devil may cry. Story 17. My wife's mother pulled her out of the Care Bears movie when she was a kid because she believed those bears were working some dark magic right from their tummies. My wife still holds a grudge over that. If I remember correctly, the Care Bears lived in the clouds and watched over children on Earth. They fought against the forces of evil using the literal power of love. I mean, if the Care Bears aren't guardian angels, I don't know what is. They're basically teddy bear angels, for crying out loud. Story 18. Sporks. I once heard someone claim, the spork is the mischief maker's utensil because it combines the assertive fork with the nurturing spoon and supposedly aims to challenge traditional gender roles. And as for tampons, a fervent religious protester stood outside a Superdrug, a UK pharmacy chain, vehemently declaring that feminine hygiene products were an insult to all that's holy and lured women into temptation. Remarkably, this God-fearing protester happened to be a woman herself. Story 19. The first would be video games. Have you ever noticed how some people claim that video games are demonic because they seem to promote violence? Yet they'll then turn around and dive into first-person shooters where they're mowing down demons and monsters left and right. And the kicker? They'll proudly declare their status as good, upstanding people. I mean, I'm not trying to paint all video games with the same brush, labeling them as either purely virtuous or wicked, but it's funny how some people are swift to cast judgment on others for their gaming habits, all the while indulging in violent gameplay themselves. The second was microscopes. I once crossed paths with someone who dubbed a microscope as a gift from the other side because it made people ponder the grand design of things. I can't quite wrap my head around that reasoning, but I suppose it's just one of those peculiar lines of thought. Then the last was hobgoblins. During my childhood, my mom disposed of a hobgoblin toy after hearing on the radio that it had ties to the supernatural. I remember feeling pretty upset by this act, confused as to why she did that. Perhaps she believed it was a protective measure or something? It's crazy how prudes label everything they don't like as satanic. If they can't handle other people's business, maybe they can just go live off the grid. Story 20. A friend's wife once fell into a religious phase where she considered anything beautiful to be associated with dark forces. Flowers, picturesque landscapes, basically anything that oozed beauty was viewed as a siren call from Satan himself. This also led to a strong dislike of Hello Kitty. Some people with strong religious beliefs from the wife's family confiscated all of my goddaughter's Hello Kitty toys and went so far as to burn them. The reason? Well, they claim there's a demon in Sumerian mythology who, much like the famous cartoon cat, lacks a mouth. Therefore, Hello Kitty was seemingly deemed demonic. And then there's the Little Mermaid, which I honestly don't know why they hate so much. Story 21. Once I had a classmate with a cartilage piercing. We had an assembly where a group of people with puppets told the story of Easter. We were walking out by the end of the show when one of the people from the group approached my classmate and asked, "What is that thing on your ear?" My classmate replied, "It's a cartilage piercing." The person from the group then walked over to where the group was packing up their things and said, "She must have worshipped the devil. Look at that disgusting ear piercing she has." Story 22. Atheism. It's more like they believe atheism is the devil's way of tempting someone away from their faith, which is why they label other religions and even different Christian sects as Satanism. Anything that doesn't align with their exact beliefs is considered satanic. The idea that they think atheists actually believe in Satan is sickening. For atheists, it's probably best to tell these people, "I don't cherry-pick which aspects of your religion I believe in, as you often do. I've chosen not to believe in any of it." In the context of Dragon Ball Z, that narrow mindset makes me feel like, if I don't like Goku doesn't mean I'm a worshiper of villains like Frieza, Cell, and Majin Buu. Hey, thanks for sticking around. If you want to watch more good stories, stay tuned to Who is the most up human you've ever encountered? Story 2 is messed up. See you there.